Okay, greetings, dear colleagues. Hello and welcome to the Sufi Studies Network. My name is Milad Milani, and I'm coming to you from Darug country. Today, I'm very happy and honored to present our guest speaker, Ismail Fajrie Alatas, who is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and History at New York University. He's an Associate Editor of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society and a Fellow of the Royal Al Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought in Jordan. He holds a PhD in Anthropology and History from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is the author of What is Religious Authority? Cultivating Islamic Communities in Indonesia, published by Princeton, 2021, along with other articles and encyclopedia entries. He is currently working on a new project that explores the relationship between religion, spatiality, and geography by looking at a transoceanic moral geography that links Southeast Asia to South Arabia. Ismail's presentation today is titled Blessed Archipelago. Sorry, I didn't pronounce that right. Archipelago, Sufi Geographical Imagery of Islamic Southeast Asia. He will speak for about 30 minutes, and we will have the opportunity to ask him questions for about 20, I believe. Over to you, and welcome. Ismail.
Thank you, Milad, allow me, first of all, to thank the Sufi Studies Network, particularly to Milad, Aidoan, and Julian for the kind invitation. I'm honored to be here, and I want to use this opportunity to present a snippet from what I am currently working on and thinking about, one that is undoubtedly crude and awaits further research and thinking. Now, broadly speaking, I'm exploring the relationship between religion, spatiality, and geography, particularly religion as a mode and labor of space making, as a particular way of talking about and making sense of space and geography beyond the rather constricting binaries of the sacred and the profane. And it seems to me that the question of spatiality has been rather sidelined in many recent anthropological analysis of Islam. Talal al-Assad's notion of Islam as a discursive tradition, to give one prominent example, accentuates the underlying temporal configuration that makes Islam a living tradition without adequate attention to the question of spatiality or geography. In fact, if one rereads his 1986 programmatic essay, it is quite clear that he was writing against older anthropological works of Islam that take seriously, albeit in a rather crude and problematic way, the question of spatiality and geography. Yet it seems to me that the question of geography and spatial structuration is as crucial as that of temporal organization in constituting Islam as a living tradition. Similarly, while Muslim ethical becoming has been posited as a dynamic process constituted by discursivity and embodiment, the role of space or particular spatial location in mediating or failing to mediate discourse and the body, or in enabling or forbidding forms of life susceptible to that ethical becoming, deserves further exploration. The works of the historians of early Islam, as well as those who focus on Islamization of different parts of the world, can taught us a lot about how crucial the question of space, the built environment, and geography to the dynamics of Islamic becoming, to the extent that we can think of Islam as not only spatially or geographically embedded, but also as spatially and geographically creative. As the geographer Timur Hammond suggests in his recent book, Placing Islam, the question of where is Islam is integral to and is inseparable from the very question of what is Islam. Thus, instead of beginning with the definition of what Islam is, it might be productive to begin by examining the practices by which people enact the where of Islam. So that is the broader conceptual context of inquiry in which my talk today is situated. And with that, let me turn to the topic of today, which is Sufi geographical imaginaries of Southeast Asia. Now, the last 3 decades have witnessed the proliferation of works that trace historical and contemporary connections between Southeast Asia and the rest of the so-called Muslim world. These works challenge older scholarships that have relegated Southeast Asia as an insignificant Islamic periphery, and those that portray Muslims in Southeast Asia as not being Islamic enough. Whether focusing on pilgrims and diaspora or scholars and Sufis, this work highlights the various trans-regional ties that link Southeast Asia to other parts of the Muslim world and the role of mobile actors in fostering and maintaining such connections. While these works may be read as attempts of recentering Southeast Asia, they ultimately remain wedded to a center-periphery model. The Islamic religious geographies they point to are ultimately that of the Middle East. It is always Southeast Asians who travel to the Middle East for devotional or educational purposes, and not the other way around. Of course, devotional travels to the tomb of Muslim saints have a long precedent among Southeast Asian Muslims. Yet the significance of the shrines is usually discussed either as local, national, or at best regional phenomena, right? Movements of Arabs to Southeast Asia, on the other hand, tends to be presented either as driven by economic purpose or by the need to instruct Southeast Asians rather than for educational or devotional purposes like pilgrimage. So the overall picture that emerges from this works thus strengthens the commonly held view of Southeast Asia as an Islamic periphery. Those from the peripheries recognize the religious or spiritual significance of the so-called Central Lands, and they embark on a devotional travel to the Central Lands, but not the other way around, right? Of course, local Southeast Asian Muslims do not always perceive their region as an Islamic periphery, though they increasingly do so from the mid-19th century onwards. For example, Islamic texts written by 18th and 19th century Javanese court literati foreground the cosmological and spiritual centrality of Java, a land where, to quote the encyclopedic Javanese Sufi epic Centini, quote, every blade of grass has already embraced the holy religion following the prophet who was chosen. This massive work of more than 200,000 lines of poetry, which is often hailed as the greatest work of Javanese literature, memorialize a moral geography of Java, a space of ethical, intellectual, and spiritual becoming. The Centini epic tells the peregrination of the children of the saintly dynasty of Giri in East Java across the island of Java in search of one another and their encounters with Muslim scholars, Sufis, elders, Hindu ascetics, builders, and craftsmen from whom they learn various knowledge from Islamic law and cosmology, Islamic law and theology, history and Sufism, cosmology and literary studies, divination and geomancy, history and various crafts and folk arts, as well as ethics and erotics, all of which are heuristically described in great details. They drew important lessons as they visited natural, sacred, and haunted places, and developed insights from the ruins and traces left by people of the bygone eras. Towards the end of the epic, the main protagonist, who has finally attained intellectual maturity and high spiritual station, after years of studying and wandering, augmented Java's religious geography by building his own mosque and a pesantren, or a boarding school. So here in the Centini epic, the geography of knowledge that is Java is presented as more than sufficient for one's moral and spiritual becoming. Thus, when an increasing number of Javanese opted to study Islam in Mecca in the latter half of the 19th century, the Archduke and Sufi poet Mangkunegaran IV admonished his sons against following those who, quote, oddly enough, deny their Javaneseness and at all costs bend their steps to Mecca in search of knowledge. Now, the picture of Java, and by extension, Southeast Asia, also gets more complicated when we look at it from the vantage point of Hadrami Sufi scholars and their followers residing in Southeast Asia, the Hadramaut, the Hijaz, East Africa, and elsewhere. Up to around the mid-19th century, many Hadrami Sufi scholars perceived Southeast Asia as worse than simply an Islamic periphery. Southeast Asia is a perilous region with strong corrupting influences on one's moral rectitude. Many Sufi scholars of the Hadramaut perceived Java, which is a term commonly used by Arabs as a synecdoche for the insular Southeast Asia, as a morally dangerous region that is often contrasted to the idealized image of the Hadramaut. In contrast to Java, the Hadramaut is spiritually potent and highly susceptible to the enactment of a Sufi form of life, a place where the streets are teachers to those who do not have teachers. Despite these idealized depictions of the Hadramaut, increasing numbers of Hadramis left their homeland and traveled to Java in search of economic opportunities. Many were forced to emigrate after facing financial difficulties at home. There were families in need of support, debts demanding repayment, houses falling apart, and lands acquiring capital injection to cultivate. For Hadramis, Java conjured up dreams of endless possibilities. Stories abound, circulating in towns and hamlets along the dry riverbeds of Hadramaut about fortunate emigres who went from rags to riches, although there were also dreadful accounts of those who got lost and drowned. The increasing number of emigrants who left for Java made the region suspect in the eyes of the Sufi scholars of Hadramaut. Java is often described as an ill-fated region and its inhabitants wayward. Unlike the Hadramaut, Java is dubbed a region, quote, bereft of noble history, where religion and pedigree are not valued and its people have predilections towards corruption, wrote the Sufi scholar Ahmad bin Muhammad al-Mihdar in his Maqama fi Dam al-Dunya. In his eyes, Java stands for dunya, right? A place where his compatriots pursue wealth and lose their religious and moral bearings. In one of his poems, the Sufi scholar Muhsin bin Alawi al-Saggaf, whose career as the judge of Sayoun was spent adjudicating conflicts involving the Nouveau Riche Hadrami migrants, write, Java, dispossessed of its alif, is Jua. So Java min ghayri alifin ismuha Jua. So, you know, if you write Java in Arabic, then and you take out the alif, then it can be read as Jua, which means crevice. So Java, dispossessed of its alif, is a crevice, where its captive fails to attain freedom. Java is the abode of wrongdoing, abode of infidelity, the worst of all abodes, the fount of all maladies, where its wealth is worse than its evil, and wicked wealth brings nothing except misfortune. Java cuts ties between beloveds and splits their unions until you see them torn asunder, living in extreme agonies, exhaustions, and torment. What a hideous life and false endeavor that the rightly guided souls are liberated from. And of course, Muhsin bin Alawi al-Saggaf also wrote a treatise called Ta'rif al-Khalaf bi Siyar al-Salaf, familiarizing the people of the latter day with the virtuous life of the predecessors, in which he discussed Java in relation to the Sufi virtue of qana'a, or moderation, right? And Java is there discussed as a place where you cannot practice qana'a, and it is a place where one will not be able to realize wara, which is another Sufi virtue or scrupulosity. As-Saggaf's sentiment towards Java was one that was shared by many Hadrami scholars and other Arabs, even those who had the chance to actually visit or lived in Southeast Asia. For example, the Hadrami Sufi scholars Abdullah bin Umar bin Yahya, who stayed in Southeast Asia between 1832 and 1834, lamented how Hadrami children in Singapore were not interested in learning basic Islamic sciences, let alone engage in the Sufi practices of their ancestors. In a letter to his son Abu Bakr, bin Yahya wrote how the Hadramis in Southeast Asia, quote, have developed the manners of the fasiqun, or the sinners, and took pride in sins and lusts. He implored his son not even to think about traveling to Java. Quote, as for travel, we do not see in it religious or worldly goodness, nor will it result in ease. I have witnessed how the people of Java are in decrepit state in their worldly gains, and such a state is still in a better shape than their religious state. They constantly engage in sea voyage, in perpetual rain, tempest, strong fear, and worries. What a life. Another example comes from the early 19th century writer of mixed Egyptian and Malay origin, who wrote, Abdullah bin Muhammad al-Misri, who wrote in his Hikayat Mariskalek, if I do not desire to visit Java, verily I have been granted divine guidance, or hidayah, greater than that granted to the white turban pilgrims bound for Mecca. And if I do go to Java, then I have been led more astray from the religion more than those who mix around with infidels. The same writer also quotes the saying of an Arab Nakhoda, Sayyid Muhsin al-Yamani, who said, quote, if God accept my supplication, then I will only ask two things, to return me to Arabia and to conceal Java from the sight of humans. Alas, how many people whose lives in this world and the hereafter have been destroyed because of Jawa. Now, these examples invite us to pose several questions that I think deserve further research regarding the relationship between morality, spatiality, and geography, particularly when we compare them to spatial and geographic imaginaries projected by Javanese Sufi texts like the Centini epic. How do these actors conceive space in relation to morality and morality in relation to geography? How do particular ideas of morality and of being moral shape their perception and experience of space? How is geography conceived, mapped, navigated, and inhabited according to varying moral narratives and rubrics? These actors were drawing geographic classifications that privileges certain places and regions based on their historicity and their susceptibility to the enactment of a particular form of life, in this case, a Sufi form of life, which suggests that their conception of geography is dynamically linked to their spatialized understanding of the past and their aspiration for the future, whether that future is temporal or eschatological. They assume that the morality of people's everyday practices is inscribed in space. Yet they also seem to suggest that space is agentive, whether in shaping human predilection and desire, or in constituting or working against particular moral relation. Now, despite these negative portrayals of Jawa in the 19th century, not all Hadramis who migrated there ended up forsaking their religion or families back home. Many have indeed become rich, but they use their accrued wealth to establish endowments for religious institutions in Jawa and the Hadramaut. There were also those who went to Jawa not only to seek their livelihood, but also to transmit Islamic teachings and cultivate religious communities, as I have tried to document in my book, What is Religious Authority? It is the itineraries of these individuals, often ignored in the broad brushstroke depictions of Jawa as a morally corrupting region, that a Hadrami Sufi scholar by the name of Ali bin Hussein Alatas was determined to commemorate when he envisaged his hagiographical encyclopedia entitled the Taj al-A'ras, or Crown of Brides. And it is to this text that I want to devote the remainder of this talk, precisely because the sense that I got from studying this extensive work is that it is a conscious attempt of conceiving and commemorating Jawa as morally and spiritually significant and deserving the attention of Muslims from elsewhere. Hence, he was writing in Arabic. Ali bin Hussein al-Attas was born in the Hadramaut in 1892 and migrated to Java when he was 29 years old to learn from Hadrami Sufi scholars in Java after completing his study in the Hadramaut and the Hijaz. So even that movement is already quite unusual, because he studied in the Hadramaut, then went to Hijaz, and then studied for advanced, pursued advanced studies in Java, which is actually is not that usual, precisely because usually people studied in Java before pursuing advanced studies in Arabia. He devoted his life to teaching and collecting various oral and written materials, and the outcome of this lifelong commitment was a posthumously published 2-volume tome that charts the trans-regional movements and activisms of, as well as miracles associated with Hadrami Sufi scholars. The Crown of Brides was composed as an expansion of a 19th century text entitled Ta'nis al-Qulub wal-Hawas, Taming the Heart and the Senses, an already extensive hagiography of a Hadrami saint by the name of Saleh bin Abdullah al-Attas, known as the Holy Man of the Ahmad Valley in the Hadramaut, written by his nephew, Muhammad bin Ahmad al-Attas. In writing the Crown of Brides, Ali performed 4 discursive operations. First, he extracted important materials from the Ta'nis. So in other words, what we have in the Crown of Brides are Ali's curation of the original text. Secondly, he provides commentaries and explanations of phrases and idioms used in the Ta'nis, particularly Sufi concepts and Hadrami colloquial terms. Third, writing in a contentious modern period, Ali adds extensive legal, theological, and rational explanations and defense of Sufi terms, concepts, and practices found in the Ta'nis that were likely to invite criticism from modernist Muslims. And most importantly for the present discussion is the work of expanding the hagiographical entries. That is, in the Crown of Brides, Saleh's own biography and tales of his miracles, tales of the miracles he performed, which is the main subject of the Ta'nis, is just one small part of the book. In expanding the older hagiography, Ali recounts the lives of Saleh's teachers, contemporaries, disciples, and those who had intellectual connections with him and his children. The older hagiography of a single saint thus grew in Ali's hand into a hagiographical encyclopedia of interconnected Sufi scholars and saints who lived across the Indian Ocean between the 18th and the 20th centuries. Ali's pen charted a geography of sanctity made up of spiritually significant names and places linked to them. The 1,653-page tome maps the mobility of myriad actors who were the vectors in the transmission of Islamic teachings across time and space, many of whom succeeded in establishing new centers of Islam in different localities, from Baroda, Kolkata, and Rangoon to Singapore, Batavia, and Bondowoso. Such a geography defies imaginaries of a Muslim world made up of unchanging centers and peripheries. Instead, it projects multiple and shifting centers of Islam and charts various moral travels between regions that cannot be reduced to a single directionality. With its meticulous penchant for biographical details, the Crown of Brides affords a granular perspective into the emergence of a geography of sanctity that centrally features Jawa. In fact, the stories of Hadrami saints and scholars in Jawa make up the bulk of the significantly thicker second volume. Over the course of the book, Ali strives to persuade his readers to recognize the region's spiritual significance. There are several ways in which Ali recenters Jawa, and he does this through the framework of Sufism. One way is by imagining Jawa as spiritually transformative, which of course is the opposite of how the region was imagined by 19th century Hadrami Sufi scholars. In The Crown of Brides, Ali tells several stories of Hadramis who traveled to Jawa for worldly purposes, but ended up becoming saints in the process. Take the life of Ahmad bin Hamza, for example. Ahmad left his arid homeland as a young man after experiencing financial hardship to seek fortune in Jawa. Interestingly, The Crown of Brides mentioned that Ahmad traveled to Southeast Asia under the instruction of Saleh bin Abdullah Alatas, the holy man of the Ahmad Valley, the main pivot of the book. The instruction came after Ahmad complained about his financial hardship to Saleh. Go to Jawa and you will find your affairs there righteous and your needs fulfilled, the saint told the disraught Ahmad. In Jawa, Ahmad became a successful merchant. His trading activity took him to the eastern islands of the Indonesian archipelago. In Parepare, a city off of the southwest coast of Sulawesi, he met a pious man who he came to admire. That encounter was transformative for Ahmad, and he decided to learn Sufism. He then went to Sumenep on the island of Madura to seek a living ascetic and traveled periodically to Surabaya to learn from a Hadrami Sufi master, Sheikh bin Ahmad Bafaqih. He then moved to Batavia, present-day Jakarta. With his accrued wealth, he was able to build a Zawiya, or a Sufi center, completed in 1876. He devoted most of his time to the Zawiya, worshiping and teaching. Gradually, he became known as a miracle-working saint. Tales of his miracles circulated not only in Jawa, but also in the Hadramaut through returning migrants. 1 year before his death in 1886, Ahmad decided to return to his homeland. The migrant who left his homeland to seek fortune returned as a recognized miracle-working saint. Sufi scholars and seekers in the Hadramaut flocked to his gatherings. When he died, his body was buried inside Saleh's mausoleum, a place of honor reserved for the few, next to the grave of the very saint who first directed him to Jawa. Another way in which Ali recenters Jawa is by presenting Southeast Asia as a region where actual saints, Agtab, right, Gutub, live, taught, cultivated enduring communities, died, venerated, and commemorated. Among these axial saints whose lives and works are immortalized in the Crown of Brides are Muhammad bin Aidrus al-Habshi of Purwakarta, West Java, Muhammad bin Ahmad al-Mahdar of Bondowoso, East Java, Ahmad bin Abdullah al-Attas of Pekalongan, Central Java, Muhammad bin Tahir al-Haddad of Tegal, Central Java, and so on and so forth, to name a few. These individuals were identified as axial saints of their era, as the Qutb. Here, the Sufi notion of the Qutb as the spiritual axis of cosmos who presides over a global hierarchy of saints, which technically can be assumed by whoever God wishes, allows for an imagination of a religious geography with a constantly changing center. For Sufis, there will always be a Qutb, and that qutb can be located anywhere, whether in Timbuktu or in Singapore. In the Crown of Brides, Ali uses this notion of the qutb to center certain cities in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Bogor, and Gersik, Surabaya, where someone believed to be the holder of that position resided and is buried, therefore turning it into a pilgrimage destination. So the Crown of Brides portrays Java as a blessed archipelago of sedimented deeds, piety, and virtue, right? An archipelago of saints that turn it into an important destination for pilgrims, higher level students, and seekers of knowledge from the Hadramaut, the Hijaz, and the Swahili coast. And this is exactly the third way in which Ali centers Java. Ali recounted the lives of these traveling students and seekers, some of whom stayed, like himself, while others returned to their place of origin after studying for several years with those eggshell saints in Java. Among these international students who pursued their advanced education in Southeast Asia were those who come from the Hijaz. For example, the Crown of Brides tells the biography of the Meccan Hassan bin Muhammad Fadak and the Medinan Muhammad al-Azab, both of whom came from reputable Hijazi scholarly families and studied with the axial saint Abdullah bin Muhsin al-Attas in Bogor, West Java in the 1920s before returning to the Hijaz. Fadak rose to become the religious advisor to Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca. When Faisal became the king of Iraq in 1921, Fadak went with him to Baghdad and stayed there for 7 years before returning to Mecca, where he became one of the leading scholars of the holy city. So, in other words, looking at Southeast Asia from the vantage point of the Crown of Brides allows us to uncover an Islamic geographical imaginary that cannot be easily fitted into the established center-periphery model. Right? As the historian Anna Bang, who works on Islam along the Swahili coast, writes, for the people she looks at and she works with, Southeast Asia is, quote, a well-known territory and by no means peripheral. So more than just a hagiographical encyclopedia, the Crown of Brides is a geographic text. It conjures a pilgrimage map that a pious Arabophone traveler can rely on to seek places in Southeast Asia where God's friends once walked, worshipped, and taught, where their remains are interned, their blessed traces stand, and where their legacies continue to endure. In the Crown of Brides, flows and movements of people do not simply point to interconnection. More than that, movements also involve the remapping of the possibilities of geography that challenges previous portrayals of Java and may destabilize an existing moral geographical hierarchy and center-periphery paradigms. So let me end not by concluding, because it is far too early for a conclusion. Instead, I want to think out loud, if you permit me, in the hope that what I have to say makes some sense. The Crown of Brides is one among many understudied Arabic texts authored by Hadrami Sufi scholars in Southeast Asia in the 20th century that foreground different ways of conceiving Southeast Asia and its moral and spiritual significance. While these texts range from hagiography and history, travelogue and novel, poetry and play, I have found it useful to think about them as commemorative texts, which is an analytic term deployed by Manakia in her study of the Persianate geocultural space. Commemorative texts may include texts of radically different generic conventions that are usually analyzed independently, which nevertheless share the common concern of commemoration. To treat texts like Crown of Brides as commemorative, and this is why I find it very useful, is to foreground its moral agenda, right? In terms of the need to remember, tadhkir, the evocative work they perform, and the mode of making sense of the present through an attempt of understanding the past. Such a text invites its readers to perform various work of commemoration, from research, writing, and refurbishing morally significant sites, to pilgrimage, or simply engaging in commemorative talk with family or friends. Among Hadrami Sufis and among Sufis generally, commemoration is understood as a practice with moral and spiritual benefit, one that is repeatedly ordered by the Quran. And indeed, texts like the Crown of Brides seek to produce individual and collective moral subjects in and through the very act of commemoration. Central to this commemorative practice is a mode of inculcating particular ways of perceiving, recalling, and inhabiting space that collapse the modern geographical distinction between physical space and interpreted place, between the concrete and the imaginal. Indeed, this text projects space and geography not as empirically objective and self-evident, but as emerging from moral action. For example, from educational and devotional mobility, the cultivation of religious community, or simply the presence of actual saints. At the same time, the materialization of such space requires an ongoing act of commemoration that essentially is a particular way of seeing, experiencing, inhabiting, as well as talking about space. In this sense, texts like the Crown of Brides are not simply informative, but more importantly, they are supposed to be transformative. Transformative in the sense that they incite readers to commit and commemorate, right? They are also transformative because they refocus our perspective to a spatialized present that is a sediment of past moral deeds, one that ought to become the site for the present and future enactment of a virtuous form of life. In other words, they present anew our spatial and geographic perception and the very meaning of what it is to be present in space. And I'll stop there. Thank you.